Imagine a world without universities, where knowledge was locked away behind 7 seals, until, in the shadows of the great cathedrals, the first centers of learning emerged that would revolutionize Europe. Welcome to the birth of medieval universities. Picture this: the Middle Ages, a time when kings and knights dominated the battlefields, but within the walls of churches, a silent intellectual renaissance was taking place. The cathedral schools were the cradles of wisdom, where monks and masters preserved ancient knowledge and planted the seeds of the first universities. These weren't just simple schools, they were intellectual fortresses, guarding the wisdom of antiquity during turbulent times. In places like Chartres and Paris, while the outside world was consumed by power struggles and warfare, scholars were studying Latin texts, debating philosophy, and rekindling the light of learning that had dimmed since the fall of Rome. Did you know that students would travel for weeks, sometimes months, crossing dangerous territories just to study under a renowned teacher? That's how precious knowledge was in those days. Without books, without printing presses, without the internet, knowledge was transferred directly from master to pupil, often through memorization and oral debates. The story of these cathedral schools is actually the story of how Western education was saved and transformed. When classical learning was at risk of being lost forever, after the collapse of the Roman Empire in the 5th century, it was these church institutions that preserved the works of Aristotle, Plato, and other ancient thinkers. They didn't just preserve knowledge, they built upon it, creating new systems of thought that would eventually challenge the very institution that fostered them. But how did these humble church schools evolve into the powerful universities we know today? And why does this medieval legacy still matter in our modern world of digital learning and global education? If you love history and want to unravel the mysteries of medieval education, like this video, subscribe to the Medieval Archives channel, and don't miss a single episode. Join us as we journey back to the 12th century, when the foundations of our modern educational system were first laid down by tonsured monks and ambitious scholars under the towering spires of Europe's great cathedrals. It all began within the towering walls of medieval cathedrals, those magnificent stone monuments reaching toward heaven. But these weren't just places of worship. They became the first organized centers of learning in medieval Europe. The story starts around the 8th century, when bishops faced a pressing problem. They needed educated clergy who could read sacred texts, perform liturgical duties, and administer church affairs. You see, after the collapse of Roman educational systems, literacy had become incredibly rare, almost a superpower in a world of darkness and illiteracy. These early cathedral schools were quite practical in their origins. A bishop would appoint a schoolmaster, often called a scholasticus, to teach young boys destined for church service. Initially, instruction focused on basic literacy, learning to read Latin, understanding scripture, and mastering the chants for church services. But here's where it gets fascinating. By the 11th and 12th centuries, these humble beginnings blossomed into sophisticated centers of learning. The curriculum expanded dramatically to encompass what scholars called the 7 liberal arts. This educational framework was divided into 2 parts: the trivium and the quadrivium. The trivium, meaning the 3 ways in Latin, formed the foundation. Students first mastered grammar, learning not just Latin language rules but studying classical texts and poetry. Next came rhetoric, the art of persuasive speaking and writing, essential for preaching and church administration. The third pillar was logic, teaching students how to reason, debate, and construct sound arguments. Once a student mastered the trivium, they could advance to the higher learning of the quadrivium, the 4 ways. This included arithmetic, not just basic calculation but number theory, geometry, studying the works of Euclid and spatial relationships, music, which was considered a mathematical science of harmonics and proportion, and finally astronomy, tracking celestial movements that determined the church calendar and religious observances. Cathedral schools in places like Chartres became legendary. The school at Chartres, nestled beneath that cathedral's famous blue-stained glass, became renowned throughout Europe in the 12th century for its teaching of Platonic philosophy and natural sciences. The cathedral itself was designed as a kind of stone textbook. Its architecture, sculptures, and stained glass windows incorporated mathematical and astronomical principles taught within its walls. Paris transformed from a modest cathedral school into an intellectual powerhouse. By the late 12th century, the Cathedral School of Notre Dame attracted brilliant minds from across Europe. Scholars like Peter Abelard revolutionized teaching methods, emphasizing questioning and dialectical reasoning rather than mere memorization. One fascinating aspect of these schools was their international character. Despite the dangers of medieval travel, bandits, poor roads, and disease, students journeyed hundreds of miles to study under famous teachers. Imagine being a 16-year-old boy leaving your village in Scotland or Italy, traveling for weeks on foot and horseback, all to study logic or astronomy in Paris or Chartres. These cathedral schools weren't just about religious instruction. They preserved and transmitted ancient Greek and Roman knowledge that might otherwise have been lost forever. When Arabic translations of Aristotle's works began filtering into Europe through Spain and Sicily in the 12th century, it was teachers at these cathedral schools who translated, studied, and incorporated this rediscovered wisdom into their teaching. The cathedral schools laid the intellectual foundation that would soon give rise to something even more revolutionary: Europe's first universities. As the 12th century dawned across medieval Europe, something remarkable was happening. The cathedral schools that had preserved knowledge for centuries were about to transform into something unprecedented: the world's first universities. This wasn't just an educational evolution. It was a revolution that would forever change how knowledge was organized, taught, and certified. The term university itself tells us something fascinating about these new institutions. It comes from the Latin universitas, which originally referred not to a place but to a community or guild of people united for a common purpose. The first universities were essentially guilds of scholars and students, collectives that banded together for mutual protection and to establish standards for their intellectual craft, much like how blacksmiths or weavers formed their own guilds. Bologna in northern Italy claims the title of Europe's oldest university, founded in the year 1088. But unlike the cathedral schools that preceded it, Bologna began as a student-controlled institution focused on law. Imagine this: wealthy students pooled their resources to hire the best legal scholars they could find. If a professor was boring or unprepared for lectures, students could withhold payment or even fine him. These students weren't young boys but grown men pursuing careers in civil or church law, and they wielded real power over their education. The story of Bologna reveals something crucial about medieval universities. They often specialized in particular fields. Bologna became the unrivaled center for legal studies, attracting students from across Europe who wanted to master Roman and canon law. In fact, a degree from Bologna could secure you a lucrative position in courts and chanceries throughout Christendom. Meanwhile, far to the north in Paris around the year 1150, a different kind of university was taking shape. Unlike Bologna's student-run model, the University of Paris grew directly from the Cathedral School of Notre Dame and was controlled by masters rather than students. Paris became Europe's premier center for theology and philosophy, where scholars like Peter Abelard and Thomas Aquinas would revolutionize Christian thought. The Paris model gave us something we still recognize today: separate faculties or departments organized by subject. Students at Paris first completed studies in the liberal arts before advancing to specialized faculties in theology, law, or medicine. Each faculty had its own customs, examinations, and requirements for degrees. Oxford University in England emerged shortly after Paris, around the year 1167. Legend has it that Oxford began when English students and masters fled Paris during a town versus gown dispute. True or not, this story highlights how universities spread across Europe, often through migration of scholars seeking better conditions or fleeing conflicts. What truly separated these universities from earlier schools was their issuance of licenses to teach, the original academic degrees. The highest qualification, the licentia ubique docendi, or license to teach anywhere, was a revolutionary concept. Imagine earning a degree in Paris and having your credentials recognized in Oxford, Bologna, or any emerging university. This was Europe's first standardized professional qualification, creating an international community of scholars centuries before modern globalization. The daily life of university students would seem both familiar and shockingly different to us today. Classes began at dawn, with lectures where masters read authoritative texts aloud, often adding their own commentary. The afternoon was devoted to disputations, structured debates where students and masters argued complex questions following strict logical rules. These weren't just academic exercises. They were theatrical performances where masters built their reputations by their brilliance in argument. Student life was notoriously rowdy. Most students were young men between 14 and 20 years old, living far from home for the first time. Medieval university towns were filled with taverns, gambling houses, and other temptations. University records document endless complaints about student misbehavior, brawling, drinking, disturbing the peace, and conflicts with townspeople that sometimes escalated to riots. Yet these medieval students were also united by something powerful, a hunger for knowledge and advancement in a world where education was the surest path to social mobility. A peasant's son with university training could rise to become a royal counselor, bishop, or papal official. The universities created a true meritocracy of the mind, where intellectual ability could, at least sometimes, triumph over birth and wealth. By the end of the 13th century, universities had sprung up across Europe: Salamanca in Spain, Naples in southern Italy, Cambridge in England, and many more. Each developed its own traditions and specialties, but all shared the core innovation of granting recognized degrees and fostering international scholarly communities. This medieval revolution in learning laid the groundwork for everything we now associate with higher education. The next time you see students in graduation robes or hear Latin phrases like alma mater or alumnus, remember, you're witnessing living traditions that began in those first revolutionary universities more than 800 years ago. But don't let all this talk of scholarly pursuits fool you. Medieval universities were far from peaceful havens of quiet contemplation. They were hotbeds of conflict, power struggles, and sometimes outright violence. The universities had become too valuable, too influential to be left alone. Everyone wanted a piece of them: the church, kings, local authorities, and even the students themselves. These medieval universities existed in a precarious balance between powerful forces. On one side stood the church, which had nurtured these institutions from their cathedral school origins and viewed them as essential for training clergy and defending orthodox doctrine. On the other side were increasingly powerful monarchs, who recognized that universities produced the educated administrators they needed to run their growing bureaucracies. This tension played out differently across Europe. In Paris, the university remained closely tied to ecclesiastical authorities, while in Naples, Emperor Frederick II founded a university in 1224 specifically to train lawyers for his imperial administration, free from papal interference. The real power of medieval universities came from a surprising source: their ability to pick up and leave. Unlike modern universities with their massive campuses and facilities, medieval universities consisted primarily of people and privileges, not buildings. If conditions became unfavorable in one city, masters and students could simply depart en masse to another town, taking their prestige, economic benefits, and intellectual capital with them. This threat of migration gave universities remarkable leverage. Cambridge University in England came into existence exactly this way, after a violent town versus gown conflict in Oxford around 1209, when local townspeople killed several students. Many scholars fled northeast to Cambridge, establishing a rival institution that still stands today as one of the world's most prestigious universities. But the most dramatic example of university conflict occurred in Paris in the year 1229. What began as a seemingly minor incident, a tavern dispute during pre-Lenten festivities where students claimed they were overcharged for wine, spiraled into a full-blown crisis. When students protested, local merchants and the royal provost's guards responded with excessive force, killing several students. In response, the masters and students of Paris did something extraordinary. They went on strike, not just for a few days or weeks, but for 2 entire years. Imagine, the greatest center of learning in Europe simply shut down. Most masters and students left Paris altogether, some going to Oxford, others to Orléans or Toulouse, creating a medieval brain drain that devastated the city's economy and prestige. This wasn't just a strike as we might think of it today. This was the medieval equivalent of nuclear leverage in academic politics. The University of Paris was exercising its most powerful weapon, its ability to dissolve and reconstitute elsewhere. The standoff was so serious that it required papal intervention to resolve. Pope Gregory IX, recognizing the catastrophic loss to the Church if Paris never reopened, issued the bull Parens Scientiarum in 1231. This papal decree not only settled the immediate dispute, but significantly expanded university privileges, granting the masters greater autonomy from local church officials and royal authorities. This papal charter became known as the Magna Carta of the university, establishing that the university could create its own regulations, that students were subject to university courts rather than city authorities, and that the university could suspend lectures in response to grievances, essentially recognizing their right to strike. Through conflicts like these, medieval universities carved out a remarkable degree of institutional autonomy that would have been unthinkable for most organizations in the rigidly hierarchical medieval world. They became privileged spaces where greater freedom of inquiry and expression existed than virtually anywhere else in medieval society. These medieval power struggles may seem distant, but they established a principle that remains crucial for universities today. Academic freedom requires institutional independence. When universities became pawns of religious or political authorities, scholarship suffered. The hard-won autonomy that medieval scholars fought for, sometimes literally, remains a cornerstone of modern higher education. And here's something to ponder. Did you know that medieval students were already organizing strikes? Like this video, share it with friends, and leave a comment telling us which discipline of the trivium you would study in the Middle Ages, grammar, rhetoric, or logic. I'm curious to see which medieval subject would be most popular with our modern audience. Now, let's dive into some truly eye-opening aspects of medieval university life that might make you grateful for your modern educational experience. If you think your school schedule is demanding, prepare to be shocked by what medieval students endured. Did you know that medieval lectures often lasted 6 hours straight without any breaks? Imagine sitting on hard wooden benches from sunrise to midday, listening to a master read and comment on texts in Latin. No comfortable chairs, no coffee breaks, and certainly no scrolling through your phone when bored. Students would arrive at dawn, often before first light in winter months, feeling their way through dark streets by memory, or carrying expensive wax candles if they could afford them. The endurance required was staggering. Since mechanical clocks were rare until the 14th century, lecture times were often marked by church bells, or even specialized water clocks within university buildings. Masters were notorious for continuing until they finished a particular text or argument, regardless of how long it took. Students would frantically take notes on wax tablets or scraps of parchment, which they would later transfer to more permanent form, if they could stay awake. Even more astonishing was the emphasis on memorization. Students had to commit entire books to memory because manuscripts were incredibly rare and prohibitively expensive. A single book could cost as much as a small house or vineyard. Most students simply couldn't afford their own copies of key texts. University libraries kept precious manuscripts chained to desks or locked in special rooms, available only at certain hours and under strict supervision. This scarcity led to fascinating workarounds. Universities employed official PCA systems, where approved master copies of important texts were divided into sections, PCA, and rented out to students or professional copyists who would reproduce them page by page. Think of it as the medieval version of a copy machine, except each copy had to be meticulously handwritten, a process that could take months for a single book. Students developed extraordinary memory techniques out of necessity. They created elaborate mental memory palaces, where they would imagine walking through familiar buildings, placing different parts of texts in specific locations they could mentally revisit. Some texts were even set to music or simple rhymes to make memorization easier. When a medieval student said they knew a text, they often meant they had committed it entirely to memory, word for word. Perhaps the most shocking aspect of medieval university life for modern sensibilities was its gender dynamics. Most universities explicitly prohibited women from attending lectures or receiving degrees. University statutes from Paris and Oxford specifically banned women from university premises, sometimes under threat of severe punishment. However, medical education tells a different and fascinating story. The medical school at Salerno in southern Italy, one of Europe's oldest and most prestigious centers for medical learning, included women both as students and professors as early as the 11th century. The most famous was a woman known as Trotula of Salerno, whose medical treatises on women's health and obstetrics were standard texts throughout Europe for centuries. Her works were so authoritative that later male scholars couldn't believe a woman had written them, and often attributed them to a fictional man. In Bologna, we find another extraordinary exception. The legal scholar Betticia Gozzadini allegedly earned a law degree in the early 13th century and went on to teach at the university. Sources claim she sometimes had to lecture from behind a curtain so her beauty wouldn't distract male students. While later scholars have questioned some details of her story, there's compelling evidence that a few exceptional women did manage to penetrate these male-dominated institutions. Here's another shocking revelation. Student accommodations were often appalling by modern standards. Most students rented rooms from townspeople, frequently sharing not just rooms, but beds with multiple other students to save money. University records include numerous complaints about leaking roofs, inadequate heating, and predatory landlords charging excessive rents. Some things apparently never change. The food situation wasn't much better. Many students survived primarily on bread, weak beer, which was safer than water in medieval cities, and whatever inexpensive vegetables they could afford. Wealthier students might establish eating clubs, pooling resources to hire a cook. Only the richest students and masters enjoyed luxury foods like fresh meat and fine wines regularly. Perhaps most surprising for modern students would be the physical punishments that were part of university discipline. Masters at many universities carried rods or switches and could literally beat students for infractions, like speaking in their native language instead of Latin, arriving late, or giving incorrect answers. Though university students were generally young men in their teens and early 20s, corporal punishment remained common at Paris and Oxford well into the 15th century. These shocking realities of medieval student life make our modern educational challenges seem rather mild by comparison. Yet despite these hardships, or perhaps because of them, these medieval institutions fostered incredible intellectual achievements and laid the groundwork for our modern university system. When you walk across a modern university campus today, you are literally walking through living history. The medieval university hasn't disappeared. It has evolved, leaving its distinctive fingerprints on nearly every aspect of higher education we now take for granted. That cap and gown you wore at graduation, the diploma hanging on your wall, the professor's title, all of these trace directly back to those first universities of the Middle Ages. Let's start with something basic. The very word university. It comes from the Latin term universitas, which originally referred not to a place but to a community or guild, specifically, a community of masters and students united in the pursuit of knowledge. The medieval universitas was primarily about people and shared purpose rather than buildings or campuses. This medieval concept still captures the essence of what makes a true university, not just facilities or endowments, but a living community of scholars passing knowledge from one generation to the next. The structure of academic degrees we use today was established in those medieval lecture halls. The bachelor's degree originated as a preliminary qualification in the medieval university, marking a student who had completed the basic course of study but wasn't yet qualified to teach. The word bachelor itself comes from the medieval Latin baccalaureus, referring to a junior or apprentice, someone who had taken the first step on the academic journey but hadn't yet become a master. The master's degree carried more weight, signifying someone qualified to teach others. When you hear Master of Arts today, you're hearing an echo from Paris and Oxford, where masters of the liberal arts taught the trivium and quadrivium to new generations of students. And the PhD or doctorate, that emerged from the highest medieval qualification, the license to teach anywhere in Christendom, the licentia ubique docendi, awarded only to those who had demonstrated mastery of their field through rigorous examination. Even the ceremonial aspects of academic life have medieval origins. Those peculiar academic gowns and caps worn at graduation ceremonies, they evolved directly from the everyday dress of medieval scholars, particularly the heavy robes that provided warmth in unheated lecture halls. The mortarboard cap is a stylized version of the square cap or biretta worn by medieval masters. When a modern graduate walks across the stage to receive their diploma, they're participating in a ceremony whose basic form was established over 800 years ago. The public conferral of degrees, often in Latin or with Latin phrases, the symbolic handshake or hooding, the procession of faculty and academic regalia, all these elements would be recognizable to a scholar from medieval Bologna or Paris. The organization of universities into separate faculties or colleges also comes directly from the Middle Ages. At Paris, the university was divided into 4 faculties: arts, which taught the foundational liberal arts, and the 3 higher faculties of theology, law, and medicine. This basic structure persists in the colleges or schools that make up modern universities: arts and sciences, law, medicine, and so forth. Oxford and Cambridge developed the collegiate system, where students belonged both to the larger university and to a specific college that provided housing, dining, tutorials, and a sense of community. This model spread to many other universities and still defines the student experience at institutions around the world. Even certain academic titles persist from medieval times. The term professor comes from the Latin professor, meaning one who professes or publicly declares knowledge. Dean derives from the Latin decanus, originally meaning a leader of 10 monks in a monastery, later applied to the head of a faculty, and chancellor comes from cancellarius, referring to a legal official who stood near the cancelli or latticed screen that separated public and private spaces in Roman courts. The tradition of academic freedom, the idea that scholars should be free to pursue truth wherever it leads, also has medieval roots. When universities fought for autonomy from both church and state authorities, they were establishing a principle that remains crucial for intellectual advancement today. The concept of tenure, protecting faculty from dismissal for their ideas, evolved from medieval protections for masters and doctors. Perhaps most fundamentally, the medieval university established the idea that knowledge should be organized, advanced, and transmitted through institutions dedicated to that purpose. Before universities, learning was scattered in monasteries, cathedral schools, and individual scholars' private studies. The revolutionary achievement of the medieval university was to create a permanent, self-perpetuating institution where knowledge could be preserved and expanded across generations. Even some seemingly modern academic traditions have surprising medieval origins. Academic publishing began when universities required masters to produce original commentaries on key texts. The thesis defense originated with the medieval disputation, where scholars had to publicly defend their ideas against rigorous questioning, and the academic conference has its roots in the gatherings of scholars from different universities who came together to address important intellectual questions. What's most remarkable about this medieval legacy is how enduring it has proven. Through religious reformations and revolutions, through the scientific revolution and the industrial revolution, through world wars and technological transformations, the basic structures established by those first European universities have persisted and spread worldwide. Today, whether you study at Oxford, founded in the 12th century, or at a university established last year, you are participating in an unbroken intellectual tradition that spans more than 8 centuries. In a world where technologies and institutions often come and go within decades, the medieval university stands as one of humanity's most resilient and successful innovations, a testament to those first scholars who gathered in the shadow of cathedrals to create communities dedicated to knowledge and understanding. As our journey through the shadowed cloisters and bustling lecture halls of medieval universities comes to a close, let's reflect on the remarkable legacy these institutions have left us. The medieval universities proved, beyond any doubt, that knowledge truly is power, perhaps the most enduring power of all. Think about it. Castles have crumbled, kingdoms have fallen, and armies have been forgotten. But the universities that began in places like Bologna, Paris, and Oxford continue to thrive more than 800 years later. They survived devastating plagues that wiped out a third of Europe's population. They weathered the storms of religious conflicts that tore Christendom apart during the Protestant Reformation. They endured wars, revolutions, and the collapse of the very society that gave birth to them. What made these institutions so resilient? Perhaps it was their revolutionary understanding that knowledge shouldn't be hoarded by the powerful few, but rather cultivated through communities of scholars and students working together across generations. The medieval university wasn't just a place, it was a living tradition, passing wisdom from one century to the next like a torch illuminating humanity's path forward. When students today sit in lecture halls or debate ideas in seminars, they're participating in traditions established by scholars who wrote by candlelight with quill pens on parchment. When professors don their academic robes for graduation ceremonies, they wear the symbolic descendants of garments, first worn in drafty medieval halls. Every time a student defends a thesis or receives a diploma, they reenact a ritual first performed when knights in armor still roamed Europe. This continuity across time raises a profound question for us today. Does our modern education truly honor this medieval legacy? In an age of online degrees, corporate university partnerships, and education increasingly viewed as just another consumer product, have we lost sight of what those first university communities were really about? The medieval masters and students believed that education wasn't just about acquiring marketable skills or credentials. It was a transformative journey that shaped the whole person, intellectually, morally, and spiritually. They saw knowledge not primarily as a means to wealth or status, but as a path to wisdom and truth. They created communities dedicated to rigorous thinking, passionate debate, and the preservation and advancement of human understanding. As we race toward an uncertain future of artificial intelligence, virtual reality classrooms, and education transformed by technologies those medieval scholars couldn't have imagined, perhaps we should pause to consider what they got right. Their vision of education as a communal pursuit of truth, their belief in the life of the mind, their commitment to reasoned argument rather than mere assertion. These values remain as vital today as they were 8 centuries ago. The great medieval universities emerged during a period of profound change, when Europe was becoming more urbanized, more connected, and more complex. Sound familiar? Our own era of globalization, technological disruption, and social transformation may be different in its details, but the fundamental human need to create institutions where knowledge can be preserved, questioned, and expanded remains exactly the same. So the next time you set foot on a university campus, or open a scholarly book, or engage in a thoughtful debate, remember, you're not just a modern learner. You're the heir to a tradition that stretches back to those first bold scholars who gathered in medieval towns to create communities dedicated to knowledge. Their legacy isn't just in the institutions they built, but in every person who believes that understanding our world more deeply is a worthy lifelong pursuit. If you enjoyed this journey into the birth of universities, please leave a like, share this video with friends who love history, and subscribe to the Medieval Archives for more fascinating stories from the Middle Ages. Whether you're passionate about knights and castles, medieval medicine, the Crusades, or daily life in medieval towns, we've got more historical adventures waiting for you. And let us know in the comments, what surprised you most about medieval universities? Is there another medieval topic you'd like us to explore in future videos? Thank you for joining us on this historical journey through the birth of universities. We'll see you in the next chapter of history.